What if December's frost carried not the silence of snow, but the screams of the condemned? What if, in the year 1863, in the bitter heart of Minnesota, 38 Dakota men were dragged beneath the shadow of a wooden scaffold, their breaths frozen in the air as a nation cheered their destruction? This was not merely punishment, but spectacle, the largest mass execution in American history, where blood soaked into ice and legacy was chained to sorrow. Before we descend into this dark chamber of history, I bid you linger in our company. Subscribe and join this procession of shadows, for each tale we weave reveals the bones beneath America's polished floorboards. Enter now if you dare. The year was 1862, and winter clung to Minnesota like a merciless phantom. Snow blanketed the earth, not with purity, but with a silence so heavy it seemed to muffle even the breath of the living. Beneath that pale silence, the Dakota people starved. Their bellies were hollow, their bones pressing sharply against skin stretched thin by weeks of hunger. The promised annuities, flour, pork, and payment had been locked away by government agents who spoke of contracts and signatures, while children's lips cracked with thirst and ribs rose like cages against the wind. In the cabins of settlers, smoke rose from chimneys, the scent of bread and salted meat drifting across frozen fields, taunting those who had been pushed to the margins of survival. The north wind carried hunger in its teeth. It crept into the lodges of the Dakota at night, where mothers pressed silent hands against their infants' mouths to muffle cries that no food could soothe. The men stared into empty pots as if the ghost of cornmeal might materialize by will alone. Elders recalled treaties written with ink and deceit, paper that promised life but delivered only famine. And as snow piled higher, so too did the despair. Yet despair is never still. Beneath it smolders anger, and anger, like hidden embers in a fire pit, waits for a breath to ignite. The agents hoarded supplies within fortified stores, guarded by rifles and arrogance. When the Dakota begged for food, they were told to eat grass, to feed on weeds, to starve in silence. The insult stung more viciously than the hunger itself, for hunger could kill the body, but mockery sought to break the spirit. In the villages, whispers grew sharper. The land had been taken, the rivers fenced, the buffalo scattered, and now even survival itself had been stolen. The snowstorm outside was merciless, but the storm within was darker still. Nights were the cruelest. The sky would clear, revealing stars like shards of ice. In those hours, hunger twisted into visions. Children dreamed of feasts, only to wake with frost on their lips. Warriors clenched their teeth until gums bled, holding back the growl of rage that threatened to spill into violence. The silence between heartbeats stretched long, broken only by the howl of wolves circling the villages, feasting on carrion the Dakota themselves could not claim. The wolves thrived while the people withered, and the balance of nature seemed to mock their suffering. By February, hunger became a constant companion, a shadow sitting at every hearth, a whisper in every ear. Some collapsed in the snow, never to rise again, their bodies stiffened into statues of grief beneath the drifts. Others wandered into the storm seeking food, and returned with nothing but frost-bitten hands and the hollow stare of despair. The settlers, warm behind their windows, saw the withering shapes passing in the distance, but turned away, telling themselves it was not their concern. Yet the land does not forget. Hunger becomes fire, and fire spreads. Beneath the snow, the embers of rebellion glowed faintly, waiting for wind, waiting for the spark that would set prairie and sky aflame. The silence of winter was breaking, and the sound that replaced it would be far more terrible than frost. The sky split open in August of 1862, as if the heavens themselves had grown weary of silence. Storm clouds swirled above the Minnesota prairie, and beneath their shadows the Dakota struck. Hunger had been their tormentor, but betrayal was the blade that sharpened their rage. With rifles and tomahawks, they descended upon farms and settlements, and the land itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of their fury. The first fires rose like beacons, twisting black smoke into the sky. Cabins that once echoed with the laughter of settlers now crackled with the roar of flames, their roofs collapsing inward like mouths gasping for air. Families fled into the fields, their shouts mingling with the thunder of hooves as Dakota warriors swept across the prairie. Chickens scattered, cattle bellowed, and human cries carried farther than any church bell. What had begun as whispers in the snowstorm of winter had erupted into a storm of blood and fire. Settlers watched their world unravel in a single day. Fields that promised golden harvests became battlefields. Women clutched children to their chests, running barefoot through thickets that tore at their skin. Men reached for rifles only to find themselves outnumbered, their barns collapsing around them as arrows whistled through the air. Each heartbeat brought terror and each breath drew smoke. For the settlers, it was a nightmare uncoiled in daylight. For the Dakota, it was retribution, a desperate reclamation of dignity long denied. Yet vengeance carries its own hunger. The prairie, once a sea of grass swaying gently in the summer sun, now bore the stench of blood and ash. Horses screamed as bullets tore through the air. Children's cries rose above the chaos, piercing sharper than any blade. The sky itself seemed to recoil, thunder rolling, as if nature condemned both vengeance and injustice alike. The wind carried the scent of burning wheat and singed hair, a grotesque perfume that lingered in the nostrils of all who lived to remember. As the battles spread, rumors ran faster than fire. Some settlers whispered that the Dakota would sweep across the state, devouring every farm, every town, until nothing remained but smoldering ruins. Others spoke of angels and demons, convinced the apocalypse had arrived on horseback. In truth, the war was not endless. Its fury was sharp, concentrated, and brutal. But for those who endured it, time itself seemed to stretch, each moment an eternity balanced on the edge of a blade. And always in the distance, the rivers bore silent witness. Blood trickled into the streams, staining waters that once fed both settlers and Dakota alike. The land, already wounded by broken treaties and hunger, drank deeply of this new offering. It was as though the earth itself had become a grave, swallowing bodies and secrets, and holding them in silence beneath the prairie grass. Dakota's fury could not last forever. The settlers called for vengeance of their own, and from the east came soldiers, muskets glinting beneath the same storm-darkened sky. The prairie would soon be filled not with fire alone, but with the clash of armies and the chains of conquest. The storm had broken, but another was gathering, heavier, darker, and more merciless than the first. The prairie fell silent, not with peace, but with exhaustion. Smoke drifted from the charred remains of cabins, and bodies lay stiff beneath a sky emptied of storms. The war had been brief, a burst of fury lasting only weeks, but its echoes stretched long into eternity. For the Dakota who survived, the end did not bring freedom. It brought chains. Soldiers poured across Minnesota like iron shadows, sweeping villages, rounding up families, binding wrists and necks with rope. The warriors who had once thundered across the prairie now shuffled in silence, their footsteps dragging through dust as shackles clinked in rhythm with their despair. Prison camps rose as crude cages, wooden stockades pressed together in haste, barbed with bayonets and guarded by the cold stares of men in blue. Hundreds of Dakota were herded inside, men and women alike, the stench of sweat and sorrow mingling in the stale air. Infants wailed in their mothers' arms, but no comfort could soothe them. The milk had dried up, the corn was gone, and only hunger remained. Some collapsed where they stood, their breath leaving their bodies in a mist that froze in the night air. The prairie that had once been theirs now stood outside the fences, indifferent, untouchable, vast. Then came the trials, if they could even be called trials. Courtrooms were hastily built, wooden benches set before judges whose faces bore no mercy. The condemned were brought in by the dozens, seated in rows, their chains rattling softly like whispers of doom. Each hearing lasted only minutes, sometimes less. Names were read, accusations spoken, and verdicts delivered with the swiftness of a guillotine's blade. Few Dakota understood the language that sealed their fate. Fewer still were given a chance to speak. The judges, impatient and weary, saw not men but shadows of rebellion. Guilt was assumed, their humanity dismissed, their voices silenced before they could rise. The sentence was nearly always the same: death, when it was not exile. The courtroom windows rattled with the wind, as if even the air recoiled from the injustice unfolding within. The men sat in silence, their eyes burning with the knowledge that their lives were already being measured, cut, and erased. One by one, names were entered into the record. Some whispered prayers. Others clenched their jaws and stared into the distance, refusing to bend even as the verdict pressed upon their shoulders like a millstone. Mothers wept silently in the galleries, watching sons condemned by men who would never know their hunger, their grief, their desperation. And when the lists were complete, the tally was announced: 303 Dakota sentenced to death. The number was staggering, but the noose would not stretch so wide. From Washington came a decree. The president himself would review the names, a final hand upon the scales of fate. Days stretched into weeks as the condemned waited, breath suspended between hope and despair. At last, word arrived: only 38 would hang. 38 chosen from hundreds. 38, their names carved into the ledger of death. The scaffold began to rise, plank by plank, nail by nail. And with each hammer's strike, the condemned felt the ground tremble, as though the earth itself mourned the judgment it was forced to carry. Yet whispers spread through the prison walls. Some of those chosen were innocent, some guilty, but all were bound by the same destiny. The rope was waiting, and the air thickened with its silence. Mankato stirred with a fever unlike any it had ever known. Word had spread like wildfire across the frozen plains. 38 Dakota men were to be executed at once. Not in secret, not in silence, but before the eyes of a crowd. The town became a hive of anticipation, its streets choked with whispers, its windows glowing late into the night as men sharpened blades, women baked bread, and children pressed their noses to the frost to dream of spectacle. Death had become a holiday, and the air smelled not of pine and snow, but of sawdust and fear. In the town square, carpenters labored with steady hands. Wood groaned as planks were lifted into place, nails driven deep, beams raised higher and higher until the shape emerged against the pale sky. A monstrous gallows, broad enough to hold 38 ropes. Each board seemed to carry a weight heavier than its wood, a pulse of doom that seeped into the ground with every strike of the hammer. The scaffold did not rise like an instrument of justice. It rose like an altar, a shrine to vengeance, built not for the gods but for the appetites of men. The townsfolk came to watch its creation, gathering in clusters, their breaths fogging in the bitter air. Some murmured prayers of righteousness, convincing themselves the gallows would bring peace. Others smiled darkly, eager to see the condemned choke on air. Children pointed at the dangling nooses as though they were ornaments for some grotesque festival tree. Yet beneath the chatter lingered unease, a cold shiver that not even the winter wind could explain. For the condemned Dakota, locked in their stockade, the sound of construction bled through the walls like a drumbeat of doom. Each hammer strike echoed against their ribs, each creak of timber a whisper of finality. At night, the men closed their eyes and saw visions of the gallows rising above them, a dark silhouette against the moon, its ropes swaying gently like serpents waiting to coil. Some prayed for mercy, others prayed for strength, and a few prayed for nothing at all, their silence heavier than words. By the time the scaffold stood complete, it loomed over Mankato like a skeletal beast. 38 nooses swung in the wind, their fibers stiff with frost, their loops yawning wide like mouths hungry for breath. Soldiers stood guard, their boots stamping against the frozen earth, their muskets gleaming in the pale sun. The townsfolk continued to gather, their numbers swelling each day, anticipation thickening like smoke before a fire. The Dakota sang in their prison, voices low and steady, songs that clung to the air like threads of memory. They knew the gallows awaited them, yet their voices did not break. The songs carried sorrow, but also defiance, as if each note was a stone thrown against the wooden walls of their fate. The guards listened uneasily, shifting in the silence between verses. And so the scaffold stood ready, its ropes swaying in the cold December wind. The wood creaked as though alive, hungry, eager. The people of Mankato waited for the day when 38 men would mount its steps. and the earth itself would shudder with the weight of their fall. Yet even then, a whisper passed through the crowd, a question no one dared speak too loudly. What if the gallows took not only the condemned, but the soul of the town itself? The night before December 26th arrived like a shroud, heavy and suffocating, pressing against the prison walls where the 38 Dakota men waited. A pale moon glowed above Mankato, its light fractured by drifting clouds, silvering the frost that clung to windows and bars. Inside, the air was stale with sweat, smoke, and sorrow. The men sat close together, shoulders touching, eyes hollow with exhaustion, yet lit by something deeper than fear. The scaffold already stood outside, its black silhouette looming against the stars, each noose swaying gently as if rehearsing for the morning. Some of the condemned prayed. Their voices were soft, broken, yet carried the cadence of rivers and drums, rising and falling in a rhythm that refused to surrender. Others wept quietly, faces buried in trembling hands, as if the act of mourning themselves was the only act of control left. A few stared into the flames of a dim lantern, their gazes locked not on the flicker of light, but on memories conjured by it, children's laughter, mothers, lullabies, the warmth of summers now stolen by snow and rope. The hunger of the past year lingered in their bodies, gnawing at their ribs even now. Yet something greater gnawed at them in this hour, the weight of finality, the knowledge that each breath was a countdown. The guards patrolled outside, boots scraping the ground, muskets slung across shoulders. Their coughs, their muttered words, became a cruel reminder that life went on beyond the prison walls, that men outside were already anticipating the spectacle of dawn. A song rose in the darkness, soft at first, then joined by other voices. It was not a song of despair, but of remembrance, a thread tying the men to their ancestors, to the rivers and skies that no rope could sever. The melody trembled in the rafters, and even the guards paused, listening uneasily, shifting their weight as if the sound itself accused them. The singing was broken by sobs, then renewed again, voices raw but steady, carrying into the night air beyond the stockade. Some spoke of dreams. One whispered of seeing his father standing on the other side of the river, waiting. Another described visions of warriors long dead, marching with fire in their eyes, calling them home. One man, younger than most, confessed through trembling lips that he feared the moment his body dropped, feared the snapping of bone, feared the silence that would follow. His words drew murmurs of comfort, hands pressed against his shoulders, voices reminding him that no man dies alone when he carries a people with him. And then there was laughter, sudden, sharp, startling. One among the condemned laughed with the kind of defiance that burns brightest in the darkest night. His laughter echoed against the walls, startling even his brothers. Was it madness? Was it courage? None could tell, but the sound unsettled the guards, who shifted in their posts, their faces pale in the lantern light. The hours crawled like wounded animals. Frost crept across the windows, thickening as if to blind them from the gallows looming outside. Each man felt the weight of dawn pressing closer, pressing harder, until the air itself seemed to tremble. When the final candle guttered low, silence fell, a silence so sharp it seemed to cut into the flesh of the living. Then came the knock upon the door. Morning broke like a blade. December 26, 1862, was cold and cruel, the kind of cold that gnawed at the marrow, freezing tears before they could fall. Mankato stirred before dawn, its streets filling with boots and breath, the crowd swelling as if summoned by a carnival rather than a ritual of death. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, their eyes wide with anticipation. Women clutched shawls tight against the frost, whispering to one another as though speaking too loudly might rouse the condemned before their time. The air buzzed with hunger, not for food, but for spectacle. The soldiers marched the Dakota men from their stockade, chains rattling like bones against stone. 38 bodies walked in solemn rhythm, their breath rising like smoke from dying fires. Some lifted their heads to the sky, where gray clouds hung heavy and silent, as if even heaven refused to watch. Others kept their eyes on the ground, every step a drumbeat closer to the scaffold that loomed before them, vast and skeletal, its nooses swaying gently in the winter wind. The crowd pressed forward, straining to see. Mothers hushed their children, fathers spat in the snow, muttering curses as the condemned passed. Yet the Dakota walked with strange dignity, their songs rising above the noise. They sang of rivers, of ancestors, of strength that no rope could steal. Their voices, though cracked with cold and hunger, filled the air with a power that unsettled even the soldiers. Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, clutching their coats tighter, as if fearing the music itself might cling to them. One by one, the men mounted the scaffold. 38 figures lined up upon the wooden planks, their faces carved with sorrow, defiance, and silence. The ropes dangled before them like serpents coiled around invisible prey. A hush fell over the crowd as the executioner moved down the line, adjusting each noose, his fingers trembling though he tried to mask it. The drums began, a steady, hollow rhythm that pounded in the chest like a second heartbeat. Then the command was given. The trapdoors fell. The air cracked with the sound of wood slamming open, and 38 bodies dropped in unison. The ropes tightened, snapping against bone and flesh. Some convulsed, legs kicking against the empty air, while others hung still, their heads lolling to the side. The sound was not a single scream, but a chorus, gasps, cries, the groan of wood, the sobs of mothers, and beneath it all, the cheer of the crowd. Yes, there were cheers, rising like waves from the mass of onlookers, as if they had witnessed a harvest rather than a hanging. But not every face wore despair. Among the swinging bodies, one man's lips curved upward in a faint smile. It was not joy, not madness, but something deeper, a knowing. The sight unsettled those who noticed, a crack in the performance, a reminder that the gallows could kill flesh but not silence spirit. Snow began to fall, slow and deliberate, settling on the ropes, the scaffold, the still faces of the dead. The crowd began to disperse, their hunger sated, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. Yet the ropes creaked in the wind, refusing silence, swaying as though the men still lingered between this world and the next. And then, in that fragile stillness, a child's cry pierced the air, shrill, trembling, unrelenting, echoing across the square like a curse that no rope could ever sever. When the bodies were cut down, the earth of Mankato became a graveyard without markers. Some were buried hastily in shallow pits, others dragged into the frozen ground with little care, their names spoken only in whispers. The scaffold itself stood for a time, its beams creaking in the wind like the ribs of a corpse. Children dared one another to touch it, to run beneath the nooses still stiff with frost, until at last the wood was dismantled, its fragments scattered. Yet the shadow of it remained, burned into the town square as surely as blood into snow. The crowd dispersed, life resumed, and the settlers convinced themselves that order had been restored. But order is a fragile illusion. At night, when the town quieted, some swore they heard the ropes creak though the gallows were gone, or footsteps crunching in the frost when the square stood empty. A few spoke of dreams. 38 figures swaying in the darkness, their eyes open, their lips moving in songs too low to be understood. The settlers buried their unease beneath prayer and labor, but the whispers carried on, slipping between cracks of silence like smoke. For the Dakota, the execution was not an ending, but an exile. Families were torn from their homelands, herded westward under guard, their grief pressed into every step. The rivers they once fished, the prairies they once hunted became forbidden ground. Yet memory clung tighter than chains. Mothers told their children